President Trump is considering the creation of 50-year mortgages. This idea of being able to spread out, to own a home of your own, to have a backyard of your own, to have a place to raise your children, this is something that Americans still dream about, and it's a dream that's becoming increasingly unaffordable. Jefferson imagined everyone would have a ticket into the middle class because they would own productive property of their own. We are less than a year away from the midterms of President Trump's second administration. And already in the elections that we've seen this year in Virginia, New Jersey, and a number of down-ballot elections, even in places like Pennsylvania, and indeed in places in the South, such as Mississippi and Georgia, Republicans have typically fared quite poorly. Now, one reason for this is that when voters are surveyed, they are expressing tremendous reservations about the state of the economy. They don't feel that inflation has been entirely conquered. Inflation is about 3% annually right now. They are seeing prices for beef in particular rise in the supermarket at a very high rate. And they are feeling a great deal of uncertainty about home ownership. Interest rates are high enough that even though inflation is not causing home ownership to become priced out of most Americans' reach, what you're getting is that instead, because interest rates are so high, taking out a mortgage and getting a new home is very, very difficult right now. And people are very worried about the state of the market. Now, President Trump is in some danger here, and indeed the Republicans who have a majority in Congress are in danger of suffering the kind of fate that Joe Biden suffered in 2024. The state of the economy is going to be the primary thing that Americans are judging the success or the failure of this administration on next year. It's also going to be the primary criterion of judgment come 2028 when Americans are choosing the next president. Whether that's going to be someone following in President Trump's footsteps as a Republican, perhaps J.D. Vance, or whether it's going to be a Democrat retaking the White House after the Trump years. So there is a tremendous need right now for a sound economic policy. And President Trump and his administration have been trying to devise new approaches that will reassure American voters and that will help Americans build wealth and especially buy homes. Unfortunately, the measures that are being contemplated right now would probably not only not work, they would most likely boomerang and have a very bad effect. In particular, President Trump is considering the creation of 50-year mortgages. The standard rate on mortgages, or the standard term of mortgages these days, is typically 30 years. Some people, including myself, have 15-year mortgages. Now, the advantage of having a 30-year mortgage is that the payments are lower than the payments on a monthly payments, that is, on a 15-year mortgage. You are paying off your debt more slowly. You may be paying a higher interest rate, but it's spread out over such a long period, over 30 years, that the payment month by month is lower than it would be if you were trying to pay off the debt much more rapidly. With a 50-year mortgage, of course, you could potentially have a situation where the month-to-month payments are lower still. This might lower the bar for people entering the home ownership market in the first place, allowing more people, younger people, to start owning homes earlier on, and then paying off the debt over the course of their entire lifetimes of 50 years. Now, most Americans don't actually hold on to a 30-year mortgage or potentially a 50-year mortgage for the entirety of that term. What they do is they buy a house, then they will sell it. If they're very smart or very lucky, they will actually perhaps make a profit. Maybe they'll even be able to pay off the mortgage and still have some profit left over. But that's hardly something that everyone can count on. And in fact, more often than not, that's not going to be the case. So what actually happens is that Americans buy a home with a 30-year mortgage. They sell it. Maybe they make a little profit. Maybe they don't. They certainly aim to make a profit. But nevertheless, what they're doing is simply trading one mortgage for another. They wind up, paying off or at least getting out of the first mortgage and then just buying a new home, which is also going to be under a 30-year mortgage. As a result, Americans are often in lifelong debt with their mortgages, even if they are not staying in a single home for the course of 30 years, which most people are not doing. A 50-year mortgage is only going to make that situation worse. So even if you did stay in your home for the entirety of the term, that's basically your working lifetime right there. And of course, if people are moving from home to home, if they're selling, in one place and buying another, that's going to be trading one 50-year mortgage for another 50-year mortgage. Again, with the exception of those few people who are lucky enough or smart enough to be able to actually make such a profit in real estate that they're able to clear their debts as well as buying a new home without having to take on more debt. It's all a mug's game. It's something which is basically seen as being a great windfall and a boon for American financial industries, for America's banks. It's a great boon for the real estate industry, which is given an opportunity to build more housing. But it's something that actually is very bad when you think about the debt level that Americans have to manage. It's also quite possible that even if you had a 50-year mortgage, that your payments per month might not be much lower than the payments that you make on a 30-year mortgage. In fact, they could even be higher. You just can't be certain what exactly the interest rates would be on a 50-year mortgage. It may very well be that the fear and the risk of default on a 50-year mortgage, a half-century-long mortgage, would be so high that banks would expect higher interest payments in order to offset that risk. So a 50-year mortgage it has very little, a very small constituency in the American public, if it has any constituency whatsoever. And it has the potential to actually make many of the things that are already flaws in our housing system so much worse. Hi, thank you for watching Modern Age with Dan McCarthy. And if you've enjoyed this podcast and others in our series, please do hit the like button and share this podcast with your friends. You can also find Modern Age not only here in video form and audio form, but also as a written journal, as a print publication that is published every 3 months, and on the web at www.modernAgeJournal.com. We will yet see whether or not this is an initiative President Trump continues to push. My sense is that a great many of the president's supporters think that this is a bad idea, not only among intellectuals, but I think there is a certain amount of resistance to this idea with the public as well. Nobody wants to remain in debt for the entirety of their lives. Think about it. In a way, this is actually a kind of American serfdom. So serfdom is a situation in which the people who work on a given plot of land don't own it. They have to work on it their entire lives. They're bound to the land. They are, earning enough to be able to feed themselves and their families, but they really have to pay a huge amount of the share of their work to the lord who actually does own the land. That's the classical picture of serfdom in the Middle Ages. We Americans think of ourselves as a free people, not as serfs. But because of debt, because of personal debt, because of mortgages, because of the fact that we may not even really own the homes that we live in while we're paying off to the banks that have given us our mortgages, we do have, something of a taste of the condition of serfdom. And even though it's true that an American homeowner who's paying off a mortgage is acquiring equity and therefore is getting a stake in ownership, it's not quite the same thing as actually owning a piece of land or a home of your own, free and clear. It's still something where you are in a financial relationship with an institution like a bank. And indeed, if you had a 50-year mortgage, you would build up equity at a very, very slow rate. So you would be paying off an enormous amount of interest, and you'd be making very small gains in paying off the principal and acquiring equity, which is actual partial ownership. It's a very bad deal and something that I think President Trump has been talked into by advisors who perhaps are looking for a quick fix, something that would kind of give people an easy boost up into perhaps owning their first homes, but that in fact would be a very bad long-term arrangement and that the American people on reflection are probably not going to go for. Now, if that's not the right approach, what could the president, what could the administration, what could policymakers of all kinds at all levels possibly do? Now, there's a movement called NIMBYism, which is not in my backyard, which says that property owners don't want to have more development in their region because that might actually have the effect of lowering existing property prices. And so as a result, there is a counter movement called YIMBYism. Yes, in my backyard is what the acronym stands for. And this is a movement typically including a great deal of intellectual young people in America's cities who want to create much more housing. They often want to do it by reducing regulation that prohibits the building or limits the building of multifamily housing in America's cities, multifamily units. In other words, YIMBYism often comes down in practice to creating more high-rise apartments in America's cities. And it's often framed not only in progressive terms, that you want to create more housing and more affordable housing, but especially in libertarian terms. This is marketed as an attempt to free the real estate market of excessive regulation, to allow construction companies and home builders to create new residential accommodations that are demanded by the market, that would be able to fulfill the needs of consumers, fulfill the needs of home buyers, and that would also, of course, be quite profitable for the real estate developers. So it's being sold as a pro-market solution to a real problem of rather constrained home ownership and the need for people to have affordable places to live. However, keep in mind the social effects of putting people into high-rise buildings, that it's quite notable that, first of all, there's a lot of sociological data which says high-rise apartment living is actually very bad for families. It's very bad for family formation in the first place, and it actually tends to suppress demographics and suppress birth rates. So already we are concerned in this country about our falling birth rates. If you have people increasingly urbanized, increasingly living in high-rise apartments, that's very likely to have a detrimental effect on American birth rates. It's also the case that the social environment of high-rise apartment living is not at all conducive to conservatism and is in fact one of the things that perhaps helps drive this sense of devotion to liberalism and devotion to a more progressive, even more progressive wings of the Democratic Party that one finds in American cities. Think about, for example, the election of Zohran Mamdani, which happened on Tuesday, November, the first Tuesday in November in the elections that were held this year. There's already an increasing tendency for urbanization to lead populations to vote increasingly to the left. Very few of America's major cities have Republican or conservative mayors or city councils. And this is only going to be exacerbated the more that you concentrate population in the cities and concentrate city dwellers in high-rise apartment buildings. So YIMBYism, despite being framed as a free market approach to a real problem, is in fact something that is ultimately going to lead probably to the election of more socialists like Zohran Mamdani. It's certainly something that conservatives who are concerned about families and family formation should not adopt very willingly or easily. Now, there may be circumstances and situations where, reducing zoning regulations and allowing for the development of more multifamily buildings is an appropriate measure. But in general, conservatives should be very skeptical of this approach, and they should see it as actually exacerbating the problems that our cities already have. So that also is likely to be a very bad idea. And it's not a good idea to have 50-year mortgages. It's also not a good idea to try to shift Americans to a lifestyle of living in high-rise apartment buildings. Think about how different, by the way, that high-rise apartment living is from the kind of living that was envisioned by our founding fathers, especially by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson imagined Americans being able to go out and homestead the country for themselves, to have plots of land and homes of their own, even to have little farms of their own, and to be an independent gentry, an independent yeomanry. That is to say, everyone would have a ticket into the middle class because they would own productive property of their own. This was very much the core of the American dream as Thomas Jefferson envisioned it, and it's part of the American dream as it has indeed been envisioned by successive generations over the last 250 years. This idea of being able to spread out, to own a home of your own, to have a backyard of your own, to have a place to raise your children. This is something that Americans still dream about, and it's a dream that's becoming increasingly unaffordable, partly because of the financialization of our economy, partly because of the disappearance of good-paying middle-class jobs in manufacturing and elsewhere, and partly because of the state of the home building and home ownership markets right now. Now, President Trump did have an idea in the 2024 campaign, which actually would have very much helped to address this. Namely, that is, instead of packing more people into our existing cities, putting them in high-rise buildings, what you could actually do is create new cities, new centers of opportunity, new places for economic activity, and then new places for home building, new suburbs, and basically a new kind of expansion onto not a frontier that's completely unsettled, but a frontier of development, a frontier that allows for the construction of new communities and new places for Americans to seek opportunity and to build family. But of course, creating new cities is not an easy thing to do. It's something that has to make economic sense. It's not really something that can be simply, well, you can in fact have governments, and this is true going back all the way to the ancient world. I mean, think about Alexander the Great, who built a number of cities. It's why in the ancient world you get a number of cities that are named Alexandria, including in Egypt, but really throughout the territories that are conquered by Alexander the Great. It's often the case that you do actually have political rulers create cities as a monument to their own greatness. Think of Constantinople, for example, today Istanbul, of course. So that can be done, but it's something that monarchs who have enormous resources of their own that they're putting into play and who do not have to worry about the consent of the public are typically able to undertake in a much more committed way than an elected American president who serves, a 4-year term or perhaps 2 4-year terms. Building new cities, even though it's the right idea in principle, is something that would be very hard to execute in practice and very hard to be led by Washington, D.C., and by the federal government. Now, there is actually an easier way to achieve the same goal. You could actually reclaim a lot of American cities which currently have depressed housing markets and which are places where people could, in fact, find homes affordably and would be very close to centers of opportunity, but that right now are not livable places because there is too much crime and too much disorder and corruption. Think of, for example, the situation between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore, Maryland. These are two cities that are so close together that they are an easy reach within commuting distance, whether by car or indeed by train. These are cities that are so close that you would think that anyone who couldn't afford housing in Washington, D.C., who's a professional, who has a job, would be able to move to Baltimore, live much more affordably, and commute into Washington, D.C. without a problem. The difficulty, of course, is that Baltimore is rather notorious for having high crime, for having, a great deal of corruption in its government, and basically for having all the problems that urban Washington, D.C. has, only to a much greater extent, and having relatively fewer opportunities. If, however, the kind of approach that has been taken towards cleaning up Washington, D.C.'s streets, cleaning up Union Station in Washington, D.C., the great train terminal, if you had an approach like that that was magnified and applied to a city like Baltimore, Maryland, you could have Baltimore become a much more attractive place to live, which would then be able to supply the housing needs and also supply actually a new sort of avenue for business growth as well within the greater Washington, D.C. area, which is an area where, of course, you do have an enormous concentration of population, and you have, because of the federal government, always a certain large workforce that is in play. You've got Amazon, which has also built offices, a second headquarter in the Washington, D.C. area. It's just a complete waste of our existing urban resources that the city of Baltimore is not turned into a city that can act as a twin, basically, or as a cooperating urban locality with Washington, D.C., and having both places be safe, clean, and locations of both affordable housing and good economic opportunity. So President Trump's approach to crime, especially in America's cities, is in fact also an approach to safer housing. It's also more affordable housing. It's also an approach that will that will foster greater safety on America's public transportation systems. And that, too, will be beneficial for America's cities and beneficial for people who want to be able to live and commute in a relatively easy manner. Right now, in so many American cities, the subways are they're dirty, they're inefficient, they are run down, and they're places where you can't take it for granted that you will not encounter serious crime. And therefore, they are discouraging people from using them, and they are sucking up an enormous amount of taxpayer dollars without actually producing the returns that had been envisioned. Taking care of crime, reducing crime, making places safe and clean is going to be an enormous benefit to public transportation. It's going to be a benefit to housing in America's urban areas and to the economies in those areas as well. And that's going to be something that will help to address this difficulty of finding housing in America's largest cities, and really not even the largest cities, but even a lot of the mid-level cities as well are places where housing prices have gone skyrocketing, and where currently interest rates are so high that they pose a problem. Now, President Trump sees a way to bring down interest rates as being putting a lot of political pressure on the Federal Reserve. That's probably a bad idea for the simple reason that if the Federal Reserve drastically lowers interest rates, that has the risk of creating inflation. That was one of the things that has been happening, before President Trump returned to office. It's something that contributed to the situation under Joe Biden. President Trump is also thinking about sending American rebate checks, or as it were, stimulus checks, based on the revenue that he's bringing in through his tariffs. And that, too, unfortunately, looks like something very similar to what happened in 2020 when Americans were sent checks in the mail in order to help them through the COVID crisis. That, too, created an inflationary pressure within our economy by basically, pouring money into individuals' pocketbooks, which they then poured into the economy. That seems great. Hey, things are selling quickly, but unfortunately, prices will also rise as a result of that. So sending people these, stimulus checks is a bad idea, and trying to lower interest rates is also a very risky gambit. Both of those measures are likely to lead to inflation. Inflation, as Joe Biden can attest, is something that will destroy an administration and put the political party that is associated with it in a deep hole with America's voters. Now, President Trump did, however, have another idea in his 2024 campaign, which perhaps holds greater promise for addressing the doldrums that parts of our economy are currently experiencing. President Trump loved the slogan, "Drill, baby, drill," when he was a candidate in 2024. This is a very good idea, and right now the administration has made moves to open parts of the Arctic National Wildlife Reserve to more resource development. We have currently a competition with China regarding not only trade in general, but in particular trade in rare earth metals. And China has an advantage in rare earth metals. It has a supply that the rest of the world needs, including the United States, partly because extracting rare earth metals from the earth is a very dirty process. And it's something the Chinese, with much lower much lower environmental protections than the United States has, the Chinese are willing to do this in ways that we Americans are not, and in ways that most other advanced economies are not. So the Chinese have a kind of stranglehold on rare earth metals, and this is something that they're using as leverage in trade negotiations with President Trump. But America does actually have rare earth metals itself, and America also has the innovation necessary, I think, the technological know-how, and also the commitment, perhaps, to research and development that would allow us to create cleaner extractive technologies. So just as America was able to go from being dependent on others in the world, dependent on the world oil market for its energy needs, America went from that to being an energy exporter as a result of fracking more than a decade ago. So too, I think America could become much more independent with regard to rare earth metals and other natural resources if we invest in being able to extract these resources more cleanly, more efficiently. That's going to require investment in research and development. It's going to require investment in energy, of course, not only because energy is one of the things that we want to extract from the earth, but also because energy is necessary for creating all of the technologies that will then be used for cleaner extraction in the future. Of course, one of the demands on our energy infrastructure right now is the rise of artificial intelligence and the building of data centers. These data centers are very controversial with voters because voters see them as placing new and greater demands on the electricity grids and therefore driving up electricity costs for all Americans. There's some argument about exactly how big the impact of these data centers is, but it's clear that Americans are very worried about this. And yet it seems that the very technology that these data centers are supporting, namely artificial intelligence, is something that could be turned to devising new, more efficient methods for, first of all, supplying energy to data centers, and second, finding sources of energy and more efficient and cleaner energy as well. So it seems one of the things that President Trump could perhaps do and that the administration could do is to encourage research and development along lines of cleaner energy and natural resources extraction, including talking to the tech companies and encouraging the use of AI technology in the development of cleaner and more efficient extraction methods for both rare earth metals, other natural resources, and in particular, oil and natural resources. If we have an energy boom as a result of more drilling and more access to natural resources, you will then have not only more jobs created in the immediate wake. You saw an enormous boom in employment in the Dakotas as a result of the fracking revolution there. You saw some of that in Pennsylvania as well. Not only do you immediately get new jobs as people flock to these industries, these hard industries, you also have this chain of research, development, and technological construction, which is going to require the creation of new fabrication plants, the creation of new technological centers, new kinds of factories as well. All of that is also going to be a boom for employment. So energy can actually serve as a wellspring for a virtuous cycle of development of technology, development of cleaner technology, more energy to fuel data centers then supporting AI, which is able to create perhaps more efficient forms of energy extraction and cleaner forms as well. And all of this is creating jobs and creating economic benefits, creating an economic boom. It's something that we've seen on a small scale for a time with the fracking revolution. It's something we can see on a larger scale if President Trump pursues this by reducing some of the regulations that are currently unnecessary and that are burdening the development of extractive technologies and energy. If we see, instead a focus on continuing to protect our environment, but doing so in a way that facilitates clean extraction of natural resources rather than making the clean extraction of natural resources impossible altogether, and therefore leaving us at the mercy of places where they do not have scruples about the dirty extraction of natural resources. And that, of course, means China overall. An energy agenda is also an economic agenda. It's a jobs agenda. It's an agenda that puts America in a very advantageous strategic position vis-a-vis China and other competitors in the world. This is something that President Trump is already very excited about, and it's something that if he leans into, I think will produce the kinds of very rapid improvements in the economy that will be very encouraging to Americans as they go into the 2026 midterms and then as they look forward to the 2028 presidential election. That's a much better idea than trying to use financial instruments, trying to reduce the interest rates, or trying to use fiscal instruments, fiscal stimulus such as stimulus checks. Those are approaches which are likely to backfire and instead create inflations. They're the kind of approaches that you saw as being so typical during the Joe Biden years. And of course, Joe Biden is a living testament to exactly what kind of results that produces in politics. The Trump administration and any wise politician should seek to create more opportunity, should seek to create, a chance for energy and natural resources to be put into play for the benefits of Americans as a whole. That creates more jobs, it helps to boost our industries, and it makes us more competitive compared to the rest of the world. It frees us from the dependencies that we have on China and that actually make us more strategically vulnerable as well.